And friends, our scripture lesson this week is taken from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." Well, friends, this is week 2 of our sermon series called It's Not Fair, where we're looking at situations where you might believe that life is being unfair to you, and that can really have a detrimental effect on us. And so we're going to look at what Scripture has to say about some of these issues surrounding fairness and how we can look at them. Now, last week we talked about how the idea is that what we really need in the world is more kindness. We need more grace. We need more mercy, that we shouldn't worry about fairness because fair can also mean equally bad. And what we don't want is for people to be treated equally badly. What we want is for people to be treated better. And so that was what we talked about last week. And today, we're going to talk about not being so quick to judge, not being so quick to evaluate a situation, because things unfold and we need to see things not just for what we see immediately in front of us, but we need to have a bigger picture before we can kind of understand what's really happening. Because in our story today, it follows a sequence of events that happens over an entire day. So it begins with a landowner hiring workers at the beginning of the day. Now, I don't know if this is true in your town. It's true in many of the towns around here that there are places, even to this day, where day laborers will gather. And they'll gather hoping that somebody who runs some kind of business where they just need labor for the day will come by and hire them. And they just go with them and work. And so, it's just that people kind of know where these spots are, where you can find the laborers that you might need. And if you know your town well, if you've lived long enough, you know where they are and you see them standing there. And I've always wondered what it's like to be there in that kind of line, waiting to be hired. But that's basically the situation that we have in our story. There are potential laborers standing around hoping to be hired, and the landowner comes and he grabs a group of them and he agrees to pay them the usual daily wage, which was really just enough money to get you through the day, okay? And so people lived, we talk about living paycheck to paycheck. Persons lived day to day in terms of their pay. And then this owner goes back and keeps hiring more people throughout the day. So every few hours goes back and hires a few more people until finally you get to the ones who are hired toward the very end of the day, who only have to work 1 hour before the day ends, and then it comes time for them to be paid. And rather than having them paid proportionally to how long they worked, all of them get a full day's pay, no matter how long they worked. Now, it so happens in the story that the ones who arrived last, who began work the latest in the day, got paid first. And what this did was it changed the expectations of the people who had been working all day. They saw this and they thought, oh, wow, those people who only worked 1 hour got a full day's pay. I wonder what I'm going to get. How much am I going to get? And so their expectations were raised because of what they saw. And when they actually got just a day's wage, they were unhappy. They were unhappy. They began to grumble, all right, because they were expecting to get more money that they had no right to expect, because they had agreed to work the day for a day's wage. But when they saw someone else getting a day's wage for less than a day's work, their expectations went up, and they were upset because of their disappointment. And their disappointment was not based on anything that had been promised. Their disappointment was based on expectations that they raised themselves based on what they saw in terms of what was happening to other workers. They failed to keep their expectations in check with what had been actually promised to them. And the owner in the story says to them, you know, you're not being cheated. You got what you were supposed to get, okay? I'm not doing you wrong, all right? In fact, you know, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that when you think about this story in the larger sense of the story, if I were among the workers, and you know, and I don't know how the story is going to end, then at the beginning of the day, the workers who were hired are the happiest workers. I mean, it may seem unfair at the end, but I think it seems unfair kind of all day, right? So at the beginning of the day, at the break of dawn, you've got all of these workers standing around hoping to be hired. The landowner comes and hires some of them. And that must have seemed unfair also. Why did they get hired and not these other people? And the people who were hired had something that's really important for us: peace of mind. You know, as I said, people lived day to day in terms of their pay. And so the people who were hired first, they knew from the moment they were hired that they were going to get a full day's wage and be able to put a full meal on the table for their family. So they knew that they were going to get a full day's wage, and everyone else who wasn't hired didn't have that peace of mind. Everyone else who wasn't hired is sitting there probably thinking, why them and not me? All right? The unfairness would have seemed to be in the other direction. Why is it that they are guaranteed the opportunity to feed their families and I am not? So actually, overall in the story, if I were to look at these scenarios and say, you know, and not having the knowledge of how it actually, you know, ends, but for the most part, I would rather be in the group that got hired first. I would much rather spend the day knowing that I'm going to put in a good day's work, I'm going to get a good day's pay, and I'm going to take care of my loved ones. I think they're in a better position. They're in a better position, but they don't realize it, okay? Because what they've lost sight of is this bigger picture. By the end of the day, when the pay is different and they're upset, they've lost sight of the big picture. And one of the things we need to remember when it comes to fairness is that it is the big picture that matters, not the snapshot. All right? It's so easy to look at a snapshot and think that things are unfair. It's so easy for us to look at a tiny slice of time, which is often all that we're able to see. We often aren't able to see what happened before. We're often not able to see what happens after, and yet we're so quick to decide that things are unfair without knowing everything that's going on. And so the unfairness that appears to exist when pay time comes at the end of the workday isn't the only thing that matters in this story. All right? There were inequities all through the day. And at the end of the day, they all got a full day's wage. They were all able to take care of their families. They all ate that day. So was it fair or was it unfair? You need to look at the bigger picture in order to get a sense of this. All right? But still, it's really tempting for people to look and compare what happens to them with what happens to others. And so what happens is that when these workers who were hired first and had that luxury of being secure all day are upset at the end of it, the owner says to them, "What's this about?" Right? Are you just envious? Are you just envious because I chose to be generous with those persons who were hired later? Is that the problem? See, because they hadn't been cheated. They had been promised a full day's pay for a full day's work, and they got it. But then they allowed someone else's pay to change how they viewed their own. They allowed what happened to someone else change their view of whether or not they had been treated fairly. And that's a really dangerous place to be in, right? We need to be able to know and understand and decide for ourselves whether justice is happening on its own. It's not a comparison, all right? Either you're being treated justly or you're not. And that's not about how someone else is treated. It's about whether you are being treated justly. It's about whether you are being treated with the dignity, the respect that you deserve. And getting a full day's pay for a full day's work is justice, all right? There's nothing wrong with that. But when they allow comparison to come into the picture, then suddenly their satisfaction is destroyed. See, their satisfaction, they didn't have a satisfaction that could stand on its own. It had to be compared to what was happening to others, all right? And once they did the comparison, it destroyed their satisfaction. You know, I know people who keep gratitude journals, right? Or people who make lists of things to be thankful for. Right? And that's a wonderful thing to do. But it's supposed to be done on its own, right? Can you imagine somebody keeping a gratitude journal and then asking to read someone else's and comparing? What would that do? It would completely negate the point, right? You couldn't have the gratitude if you're comparing your gratitude to someone else's and saying, wow, I was grateful for these things, but their things were so much better. That'd be an awful thing to have happen. Yet that's kind of exactly what happens in this story. When they began to compare, they no longer knew what to be satisfied with, what to be grateful for. Now, sadly, this is something that is actually kind of natural to us. There's a wonderful YouTube video that came from a TED Talk. The TED Talk's about 7 years old, something like that. It's by a professor named Frans de Waal. He is a primatologist. He studies the behavior of primates at Emory University in Atlanta. And he studies specifically moral behavior in animals. And so he gave a TED Talk about moral behavior in animals. And I really encourage you to pay attention to this for a couple of minutes. You may have seen it online. It's been kind of viral on Facebook at times. It's really, really hilarious, but it's also really, really telling about the roots of natural behavior.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees, but with Sarah Brosnan we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber, for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, it's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
I mean, that is absolutely hilarious. But the thing that you see there, even with primates, right, even with monkeys, is that comparison destroys satisfaction. Because think about what happens with that first monkey, right? The first monkey, right, the first time it did the task of giving the rock to the researcher and got cucumber, it ate the cucumber. And then after it saw the other monkey get a grape, it threw the cucumber back. It didn't even end up with the cucumber. And so it ended up worse off than it had been before because of the comparison that it made between what it was getting for the task and what the other monkey got for the task. All right? And that is one of the things that we're at risk of doing. That if we start comparing, we're going to be worse off than we were. All right? It's not even going to be the same. We're going to be worse off because we will lose our appreciation for the good things in our lives. And that's a bad thing in a much larger sense. It's a bad thing in a much larger sense because it changes our worldview. It changes our worldview so that we begin to see the world as a place where something bad is happening, right? That monkey went from appreciating the cucumber as something it could eat to seeing the cucumber as something that was bad. And that is not good for us. It is not good for us to see the world as bad instead of seeing the blessings that are there for us and appreciating those blessings. See, one of the things that I think we miss in this story when we focus so much about the inequity in the compensation at the end of the day is that we miss another element of this story. When we get focused on that comparison, we miss something that I think is really at the heart of the story, and it is this. At 5 o'clock, when the landowner goes out and sees those workers who are still standing there, all right, he says, "Why are you standing here idle all day? Why are you still here?" And they said, because no one has hired us. And not only does that, make me feel sorry for them, it also makes me think about the fact that they were still waiting. It's 5 o'clock. The day's almost over. Who needs a worker for an hour? They could have just given up and gone home, but they didn't. They hadn't given up. They stayed there. And then when they were told to go into the vineyard, They went in, maybe they thought they were going to get, 1 hour's pay, which in that economy wouldn't be enough to feed their family. Maybe they thought it was going to be a real meager meal that night. Maybe they thought that they were going to have to, share a tiny amount of food, and yet they were willing to do it. And so they stayed, they waited, they didn't give up, and then they got that full day's pay. And so what I see in this story that it's so easy to overlook is that this is a story of hope fulfilled. This is a story of the workers who didn't give up, who stayed there. They saw the other workers get hired at first thing in the morning, and they saw the workers get hired at 9 a.m., and they saw the workers get hired at noon, and they saw the workers get hired at 3, and they still stayed there. And I got to tell you, looking at the story in that way, hit home a little bit with me because, I'm getting up there. In terms of my life, maybe it's a little closer to 5 o'clock than I would care to think. And yet, there is hope. And yet, for all the things that have come to fruition in my life, I am so grateful. And for all the things that are still a not yet in my life, there is hope. And what we need in this world is not jealousy or envy about what we don't have. We need the inspiration to remember that there are so many things we have and so many things we may still yet have. All right? We don't know what's going to happen, but we hope for the best. And we need to hope for the best, not just for us, but for others. Some of you during this time have been like those workers who were hired first. I'm in that category because I've been able to have my job, right? I've been able to have my job. We've done our best here at the church to keep everybody employed, right? We've kept everyone who was on payroll, thanks to your generosity. We've done it. And so we're like those workers hired first thing in the morning. We've been the same during this time. Others have not been so fortunate. Others have been laid off. Some have lost their jobs. But I hope that at the end of this or somewhere through this, that not only do you get those jobs back, I hope you get better jobs. Right? I hope that hope is fulfilled. I hope that something better comes out from this. And if you see that happen, if you see somebody who got, laid off and then they got a better job on the end of this, don't you dare be envious. Be happy. Be overjoyed because they stuck it out. And their hope was fulfilled. And so that means for all of us, when we see that around us, the hopes we still have might be fulfilled. Because so much of our happiness, all right, is about what's inside of us, not what's outside. It's about the attitude we have inside. And we're going to be talking a little more about that inner attitude, next week, in the final week of our series, It's Not Fair. We hope you'll join us for that service. Amen.